G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this video is a top 10 tips for using Copic markers. So this picture you're looking at here was coloured in with Copic markers, which I suppose is somewhat contrasted by the fact that it's holding colour pencils, but that's okay, because with art there are no rules. Let me start off before I jump into the top 10 tips by explaining a little bit of my experience using Copic markers. So this is one of my folders with my many Copic marker illustrations, and I love working with them because the results almost look like printed pieces. They're really vibrant, and depending on how you use them, you can get some really great results. And I want to go through, let's, ignore some of these. I want to go through some of my top tips when it comes to using these Copic markers, because you really can get some very fun, very cool results. Now, truth be told, they're actually a little bit more vibrant outside of the packets that they're kept in, and then you can see here the colors are quite rich and can be really gradiated and look somewhat seamless at times depending on how they're applied, and you can get really cool results. This is my Copic marker collection. I have the 72A and the 72B set, but that is quite a lot of markers, and you can have maybe 32 markers and be very satisfied for a long period of time. I, of course, however, am an addict and like using them every week in my streams, so that's why I have a lot of them. As far as recommendations as to what markers to start off with, I won't talk about that in this video, but I did do a how to get started with Copic markers video that I'm sure you'll find very interesting if you like this video. So I'll link to that on the screen and in the description. Make sure to go check that out. But in the spirit of getting started with Copic markers, our first tip today is blending. Now, what I mean by blending is, let's say you have two markers, a lightish blue and a darkish blue. One of the coolest things about Copic markers is that you can start off with your lightish blue and then add shadows or midtones with your darkish blue. But like I said, because they're alcohol based, you can go back to your lighter marker and mix them in a bit like that, and sort of swapping slightly between the two markers, you can build up a tone and a gradient between your colors. There are other alcohol-based markers that may be cheaper or more affordable that can do the job as well, so I wouldn't recommend not getting those if that suits your budget better, or if you think that they're fine and prefer those as well. It's up to preference, but that blending thing is the number one and most powerful and useful tip that you can use when it comes to Copic markers. Tip number two, and of course very connected to this blending theme, is paper. This is very important. I just did this gradient on blending cards, so it's going to be more effective and it's not going to bleed as much on the other side. You can see that there is some bleed, but it doesn't sort of seep through all the way to the point that it's painting whatever's underneath this card. So I'll fold over some ordinary printer paper here, and I'm just going to do the exact same thing, starting off with my lighter tone, and then I'll add my darker tone. Now, the result doesn't look too bad. The problem is there is a limit to how much you can build up, and normally if you work on blending card, you can add quite a lot and build up colors and change tones, mixings and saturations quite a lot, whereas with printing paper you can see that it bleeds through quite a lot because the paper is quite thin. The blending is okay, but again, there is a limit to how much you can add. Let's say instead I'm using a sketchbook. You can see that it's absorbing into the paper very quickly, and this isn't great because it actually limits how much blending we can do. By the time we get back to our highlight marker to blend, it's already sort of soaked into the paper a bit, and we can't get a seamless blend across from these tones. And even though this paper is thicker, it still does bleed through a bit, as you can see there. So not as ideal even in a premium sketchbook. So I have two recommendations when it comes to alcohol-based markers. The first is blending card. This is what I use for all of my final colored artwork. It's really great quality, nice and thick, nice and smooth, and great for blending. And then my other recommendation when it comes to mixing and just miscellaneous usage is something like this. This is some bleed-proof thin paper, and often if I'm testing colors, I will just bring this onto the side here and I'll whack on my colors. And paper like this is great because you can test your blending out and it won't bleed through. It's not great for final artwork, but it's good for just sort of creating color palettes, and you can get a pretty accurate and clean result with your blending on just some really cheap and easy blending paper like that. Tip number 3 for Copic markers is that you can refill them. So I have here a neutral grey N5, and you can see that as I put this down, it's nowhere near as juicy and lovely as the other tone that I just put down. It looks quite dry and a little bit soulless and sad. And that's because I use my mid-tones in the neutral greys, the cool greys quite a lot. So as a result, I've purchased this. This is refillable various ink for Copic markers, and this is my N5 refillable ink, and I can refill my ink quite a number of times with one of these inks. So there are fancy schmancy systems you can get to refill your Copics where you pull out the nib and you get a little funnel thingy and you pour it in and blah blah blah, but you don't actually need to do all that. You can quite simply, on the chisel tip, drip by drip, pour on your various ink like this. So one drip at a time, I'm actually pouring it onto the end chisel tip, and you can see it soaking in. I almost anchor the various ink bottle onto that end of the chisel and slowly push, and it has a slow steady stream of ink going into the marker. Now apparently the best way to gauge how this is going and if you've put in enough to make a difference is if the other end of the marker is starting to look nice and juicy. Okay, I think for the purposes of this demonstration, that should do it. And already just after that, you can see I've got a nice, juicy N5 marker. My next tip, number 4, has to do with this funny looking thing. This is the number 0 colorless blender, which confused me when I first got it and didn't quite know what the purpose was. Basically, it's just colorless alcohol for the alcohol-based markers. So tip number 4, when it comes to the colorless blenders, you can use these to push or soften your ink or the color you've placed down. As an example, let's say I have a square here, and let's fill this in with a nice solid orange. Oops, I've gone over the edge there. Oh no, I've ruined my illustration. Well, fear not, because with a colorless blender, basically by applying and reapplying this, we can sort of push that ink back. It dissipates the saturation of the ink, spreads it out, and it doesn't make it perfect. It doesn't completely restore to perfection, but given how saturated and intensely obvious it was when I first drew it, you can see that that really has helped push it back as if it hasn't gone over the edge. It's not perfect, but it's a nice little cleanup tool. And another little tip or trick I can share is that, let's say you want to have a fade out from a light yellow to complete white, or the white of the paper. Now you can get pretty close to that just with my barium yellow and yellow colors, but it's still not going all the way to white. And so colorless blender is sort of like blending between the color of the paper itself into your lightest color. So I can actually blend with that barium yellow and create much more of a gradient into that seamless white. Now you'll notice when I apply it both to the edge of the square and to the edge of this barium yellow, it goes down and sort of wets the paper and it looks like a sort of a very light gray, but that's just because of the wetness. So I'm actually going to speed this up for you in the video and you'll see it dry quite quickly and see the difference that makes. So there you go, once it's dry you can see that we've created a seamless transition with this yellow into the white of the paper, and our big drawing mistake on the edge of the square is almost gone. It's not perfect, but something like that can be done in layers. So once it's dry, you can sort of work on the rest of the piece and then come back and then push it in a little bit more, and then go work on the piece a little bit more and then just push it in a little bit more. But it gives you a little bit of flexibility so that, unlike with water-based inks, once it's down, it's sort of done. You can sort of backtrack and push things around just a little bit and make some tweaks with alcohol-based markers, in particular these Copic markers, that you can't otherwise. Which brings me to a question that people ask quite often. If you use a colorless marker, won't it taint the marker, the tip of the marker? If you, let's say, go over this blue here, won't the tip of this colorless blender have that little bit of blue permanently in the marker? The answer is actually no, and that's the great thing about these alcohol-based markers. Even if I got something as contrasting as a rich red like this, and then went in with my light yellow, obviously I can blend these and they affect each other and can mix, and you can see the ink sort of coming off onto the tip of my yellow marker and mixing in with my yellow ink here. And yes, if I immediately went from here to drawing with my yellow marker, you can see that it is somewhat tainted with the red ink. But I recommend being fearless with your Copic markers, and if you blend in a really high contrasting, high saturation area like that, just go over to a piece of scrap blending card or blending paper and just scribble on the paper. You can see the red ink come off, and then I'm left with my pure golden ink. And the same goes with the colorless blender. I can go in here with this red and you can see that I'm pushing that red around even to the edges of here, and if I use my colorless blender after drawing quite a lot on this red and then just draw over here on the side, it does sort of come off on the paper, but the alcohol in the tip of the marker and in the ink of this marker is pushing whatever other color ink is on the edge of it off of the tip of the marker. So you can't permanently ruin your alcohol-based markers, or at least I haven't experienced that be the case, and I've been using my Copic markers every week for a couple of years now. So for my next tip, I'm going to start off by filling in this circle here on the left. Now, this next tip isn't actually about coloring in broad areas, but I will just sort of say that in coloring in broad areas, I would go in one direction to start off with. One direction. And if you go in one direction, that's what makes you beautiful. I'm sorry. I'll stop. That's terrible. I would keep all my strokes going in one direction, and then I would go back and overlay the whole thing in another direction. And then I might even do that a third time, but the result is a nice, clean, flat color where you don't see the strokes of the marker. So my next tip slash trick utilizes this colorless blender again, and that is that you can facilitate or create textures by using the colorless blender in saturated areas. So for example, in this ball like this, I can draw in these little dots. These slightly diagonal dots will slowly but surely dissipate the ink. And much like all of the other tips and tricks with the Copic markers, the more you build up the ink and the effects, the more of an impact you'll get. So when you start to see the ink start to dissipate, you can go back to your colorless blender and reapply section by section, wait till it dries, do it again and again. And you can use your colorless blender both to texture and to soften. So I can take my wide marker and I can just paint over a larger area like this, and you can see very quickly the ink starts to lose a little bit of its solidity, a little bit of its saturation, and you can get some pretty cool effects just by doing this. It almost starts to look weathered and aged. This could be really useful for miscellaneous background effects. So let's say I want a smoke or sort of a mist with like some pink blush colors behind a character illustration or in an environment I'm drawing. I can paint down some colors like this. Now obviously that looks quite harsh, and if that was on an image with some character illustration, it would be a bit contrasting and perhaps distract the eye a bit. But if I get my colorless blender and apply very, very liberally, you can get some really cool subtle textures and effects that you can use in the background of images. And already you can see that though it's not perfectly soft, it's quite a bit softened and a little more misty, and I would wait for that to dry and apply it maybe a second and third time until it's a nice, smooth, faded mist in the background. So here's an illustration where I've applied this in the background. I have my yellow flames and I have softened those quite a lot by adding a lot of colorless blender. Similarly, in my illustration here, I've done a similar thing. You can see that there is quite a clear cloud form behind her, but it lacks that real sense of oversaturation and solidity, and that's because I've smacked on a whole bunch of colorless blender, and it really does push it into the background and almost add a little bit of a depth of field effect, which is really cool. So my next tip, number 6, is on how to blend. Now I know I did mention this at the start, and I did sort of roughly describe the uses of blending and demonstrate it a little bit, but now I'm actually going to go step by step how I would gradiate and blend from a mid and light color to a very dark and rich color in a really smooth way. These 4 colors are the colors that I use for a lot of my skin tones, and I can vary in the applications of these, so I can have lighter or more tan or more dark skin tones, but these are all really useful to use together. And the way I think about blending is, let's say our lightest color is referred to as 1, our mid-tone or mid-light is 2, then our mid-dark is 3, and our dark tone is 4. The order in which I apply the colors and the markers would be 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 4, 3, and then sometimes I'll go back to 1. Now, I think this does seem complicated at first. I'll explain it to you and then I'll show you an application. So I'm starting off with my lightest tone, then I'm going to the next tone down. But before I move on to the next darkest tone, I blend between these 2 tones with the previous light tone. Then I move on to the next level of dark tone, which would be 3, and then blend with the previous lighter tone between that and that dark tone. Then I move on to the darkest tone and blend with that and its previous light tone. In application, I'll paint, let's say, a highlight area of skin tone like this. Then I'll go through number 2. And the reason I do it in this order is because it doesn't have to be perfect. but it gives you a system to sort of blend as you go. So that's my number 2. I'll have those colors intersect in the middle here. And let's say I really just want to blend in this middle section. That's when I go back to my number 1 and just sort of roughly apply it in that intersecting area. I don't need to go crazy with it because we're blending as we go. Then I'm going back up. So I'm at this stage now to my number 3, and I'm bringing that gradient out a little bit further. So now our tone's getting a bit darker. And where it intersects, I go back to that previous tone, which is the number 2. Just at the point of that intersection, I add my marker, my slightly lighter marker, and blend between it. And the reason I do that is because we want to blend the markers when they're a bit wetter, because they blend better that way. You don't want to paint it all and then go back and blend, because then you need to use more ink to wetten it all up and get it to blend again, and you can sort of desaturate and lose the strength of your tones overall because you're sort of over blending. And then our last step is going to our number 4. Now, while this darker tone is still wet, I go to the previous marker, or what I will refer to as number 3, and apply it to the intersecting area. And then when I say sometimes I go back to the number 1, that's because every now and then it might just need a little bit of general softening, and it's just safest to go back to our lightest tone if we want to just do a little bit of touching up, because we can't oversaturate our lighter area or make it too dark, but it will help us then push our colors around just that little bit more, create that final section of blending without worrying about messing up what we've already put down. So they're the steps I follow when I blend. I start off with the lightest color, and as I go to each next color step, I jump back very quickly while the ink is wet to slightly blend between that and the previous tone, and then I move forward darker tone by darker tone. And as you can see, the result is a really nice smooth gradient on this ball here. Our tones are quite clear from one to the other, and yet we have a nice clean gradient between them. My next tip is about saturation, or what I call tinting. Let's say there's a really sort of light grayish purple you want to get, but you only have really rich purples like this, or really light purples like this. And let's say you want something that's a bit darker, sort of around this level of darkness, but not as saturated. Well, what you can do is, let's say, paint with grays by using, let's say, a C2 and a C4. Once I paint down my grays, I can go back with my purple and sort of tint this and get that sort of richer, a little darker grayish purple that I was going for without actually having it as its own ink. I only used this color here and my grays to get that sort of steely purple darker tone that I wanted. So you really can mix colors to create combinations you want, even to the point, to an extent, that they're sort of like watercolors. What I mean by that, of course, is if I paint down a rich yellow like so and a rich blue like so, by intersecting them, I can create a green that is sort of a mid-tone between them. If I wanted a tone like this and I don't actually have that as an individual marker, you can play around with the tones and markers you have to find a saturation that you want. I find this method particularly useful if I want a really desaturated color in a darker tone, which can be hard to come by. Quite often I'll paint in my grays, my neutral or cool grays, using quite dark colors, say my N5 and my N7. It allows me then to put in a slightly less saturated color to create a tint and a really rich, deep, desaturated tone of any color I want. So if I go in here and add my caramel and apply it liberally over the already painted gray area, you can see I get this sort of rich, deep brown, where the color on its own looks like this. My next tip is to test with inks. And this is probably one I should have covered earlier when I was talking about blending and paper in particular. Ink is a bit of a mixed bag. There are some fine liners and brush pens and things that won't smear or spread, and there are some that will. So when I first got my Copics, I did this, and I recommend you do this as well. Basically, I'll draw a line and maybe a few hatches with an ink pen, and I'll write, this is my Copic pen. This is my Pentel brush pen. I love this pen because I can go really thick to thin like this. So I'll maybe add some marks like this. This is my Unipin fine liner, so I'll write Unipin. This is another brush pen. It's a Pigma brush pen. And then I have another brush pen, but this time it's a Copic multi-liner brush. So similar sort of thing. I'll do some lines like this. And alternatively, you might actually like using traditional inks like this India ink here. So I'll paint this here and I'll write India. And you really can test this out with anything. So I have a permanent marker here, so I'll write perm. And let's use a Sharpie for the sake of it as well. Now, any of these will smudge if they're wet. So if you're testing out your inks, make sure to give them ample time to dry before testing them. And now that the inks are dry, I'm gonna test these out by going over them with a marker. And I recommend doing this with the ultimate culprit of smudging, a nice bright yellow. I don't know why, I don't know what it is about bright light yellows, but it's just the most noticeable when it comes to mixing and smudging. I start off by doing a couple of strokes on each of these, just to see if there's any immediate bleed. Whoa. As you can see, immediately the India ink has quite a lot of smudge. Obviously, I can't use the India ink. And then, closest to the more solid lines I drew, I'll go over with my marker again and just add a little bit of saturation just to see what happens. And the verdict is a big fat no for India. And I would honestly also say a no to the permanent marker. Not only because the permanent marker itself looks a bit cheap and not nice when mixed and applied, but you can see there's a bit of bleed there too. Now the brush pen, the Sharpie and the Pigma all have a little bit of bleed, but not too bad if the ink is fully dry. But the reason I draw around with my maybe orange is because I do use these sometimes, but usually after I've colored in. So sometimes I'll color in a whole piece and then I'll go through with my Sharpie or brush pen and add some deeper areas or some extra edges. So it's not worth ruling them out to use when you're using Copic markers, but usually I leave them till last. But if you want to do your inking first, then the uni pins, the Copic pens and the Copic brush pens all seem to be a tick. So there you go, that's my testing of the inks. That's how I would go about it. It's definitely worth experimenting with and you won't ruin your Copics if you get results like this. Once again, just use that marker on a piece of paper and scribble on it until you get all of the ink out, and you can see pretty quickly it actually comes out like that. Tip number 9 is to create tonal interest. And what I mean by tonal interest is essentially rather than having, let's say, an orange ball, which is quite simply a range of orange tones from a lighter orange tone to a darker orange tone, we can create tonal interest by having, let's say, a blue light on the edge of that ball to create a really nice contrast, or we can mix it into a light barium yellow in the center of the ball. And the point of that is, of course, that if we stick to one range of tones, like an orange, then it can end up looking flat, even though we have great contrast and color. But if we mix in different tones, even to the point where we overlay things like a purple or a violet around certain edges to reflect a certain light, we can mix in and create some really cool results. Now you'll notice that I'm playing around on a piece of paper separate to my ball here. Let's say I want to color this ball in a nice turquoise blue. What I will first do is test on a piece of paper and find the mid-tone that I like, and then I'll play around with dark and light tones, but I'll also push around the edges to find some other tones that might work well with that turquoise blue that I picked. So that's a really nice dark tone that I might work with. We might draw a green here, that might be a touch too green. And it really is a matter of experimenting, playing around until you find the tones and mixes you like. To be honest, what I just drew, this has much more of a green tone than the dark tone I just drew, and I think looks quite nice and is a bit different. So I'm actually going to use that as my dark tone instead. And then this tone has that nice light, more bluish tone, which I'll use for my highlights. And then right around the edges of the ball, I'm going to use a golden yellow and a touch of yellow, just for some light that's going to really contrast with that overall tone. Ta-da! As a result, we have a finished orb that, though it doesn't look exactly like one color, it still solidly would look like a turquoise sphere, but at the same time we've created some tonal interest by mixing in a touch of the greens and blues and then a really contrasting color around the edge as a light source. In this Spider-Man piece, I kept the edges of the silhouette ready for a gold to sort of hit on, which emphasizes the silhouette and contrasts with that deep red and blue color. In this picture I did of the Hulk, you can see that rather than him being just green, there is orange and red in the bottommost parts of his character's silhouette and figure that almost looks like there's this heated light underneath him, and that creates a really nice tonal interest. Even the purple of his pants still has that orange light and that glow from underneath, and that does create a variance in tone that looks cooler than if it was just green and purple. My very last tip is about edges. Now you can see two little problems here. They're not huge problems, but they're little problems. One is that we have ink going over the edges here, and then two, we have a little problem in the line sort of intersecting there. My preferred method of going about creating Copic illustrations is to work with a thin fine liner first, then go through Copic colors, and then go through with a slightly thicker fine liner just around the edges. So when applied to something like this, for example, we have our thin fine liner for the ball, I've done my Copic colors, and then I might go around with a slightly thicker fine liner like this, and this helps sort of resolve those two issues. This one was sort of rushed a little bit, so it's not the perfect example, but you can get a rough idea as to how you can sort of eliminate the Copic going over the edges just a little bit, and you can also help clean up your line work. This is a bit messy here, so ignore that, but it is a method that I use and I go through a lot slower and more carefully, and it does help clean up the image overall in a really nice way. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, they are my top 10 tips for using Copic markers. I hope they've been helpful. I use them all the time. They're really great and I highly recommend them. I'll put a link in the description again to my Getting Started with Copic Markers video, which goes through a little bit of the blending and mixing stuff. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't and you enjoyed this video, and until next time, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new content every week. If you want to support my work and get some goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, digital brushes, video courses, and more. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to another video you might like from this channel. And if you want even more, make sure to check out all my behind the scenes action on my vlog channel, Daily Jazza. Draw with Jazza is proudly sponsored by Adobe. Join the Creative Cloud today and get loads of incredible creative tools like Photoshop, Animate, Premiere Pro, and other apps for your computer or mobile device. That's it for now. Thanks for joining the arty party, and until next time, I'll see you later.